I know it's there. I've got to believe it because I see the reactions, I see the...
Audrey Hepburn spent the last months of her life returning to one name. Not a husband, not a co-star, not the actor who had proposed to her on a California film set when she was 24. The name she kept coming back to, with a quiet consistency that surprised even those who knew her best, was the name of a man most people wouldn't expect. And when you understand who he was and what he took from her when she was 6 years old, the entire arc of her life begins to make a different kind of sense. Every man she chose, every heartbreak she stayed in far longer than she should have, every child she sat beside in the camps of Ethiopia and Somalia, all of it connects back to one departure that never stopped echoing. She was born in Brussels in 1929, the daughter of a British father and a Dutch baroness, into a family that moved constantly between London and Arnhem and elsewhere, following the work of her father, Joseph Rustin. 6 languages by the time she was a young child. On the surface, a cultured, cosmopolitan upbringing. What ran underneath was something else entirely. Both of her parents had been open supporters of the Nazi regime through the 1930s, not quietly, not ambiguously, but actively, attending rallies in Germany and aligning themselves in public with its ideology. Then, in 1935, when Audrey was 6 years old, her father left, not swept away by war or circumstance. He chose, quite deliberately, to walk out, absorbed in fascist politics, relocated to London, and never came back for her. That abandonment became the defining wound of her life, and she said so herself in later years. Boarding school in Kent followed, and she sat through holidays watching other children go home while she waited. Her father had visitation rights and never used them. He simply didn't come. Then the war started, and Audrey was sent to the Netherlands in the belief that it would be safer there. The German invasion arrived in 1940 when she was 10, and what followed turned the rest of her childhood into something most adults spend their lives trying to forget. She adopted a Dutch name, Etta van Heemstra, to avoid being identified as English. In 1942, 2 of her uncles were arrested and executed by the Nazis. After that, she stopped trying to stay invisible and joined the Dutch resistance, carrying messages and underground newspapers, sometimes with them tucked inside her shoes. Ballet had been her entire dream before the war. Now she used it differently, performing at secret fundraisers for the resistance in rooms where silence was mandatory because a single sound could get them all killed. By 1944, the famine that swept through the Netherlands during one of the coldest winters on record had reached her family. German blockades had cut off food supplies, and her family ate tulip bulbs to survive. Malnutrition, anemia, respiratory illness. The girl who would later become one of the most photographed women in Hollywood was at that point a starving teenager, hiding from a war her own father had once publicly celebrated. When liberation finally came, a UNICEF worker handed her a chocolate bar. She never forgot it. That moment lived in her for the rest of her life and eventually pulled her back to the work she felt she owed. The psychological pattern that took shape in the years that followed has been studied at length by biographers granted access to her personal correspondence, and what they found was consistent and not difficult to trace. The men she chose tended to be older, authoritative, and controlling. Mel Ferrer fit that profile with uncomfortable precision. They met through Gregory Peck in the early 1950s, were cast together in Ondine, and by September 1954, they were married in a quiet ceremony in Switzerland. What had started as a creative partnership between 2 cultured, multilingual people deeply invested in the arts slowly became suffocating. Ferrer had strong opinions about everything: which roles she should take, how she should present herself publicly, who deserved her time. The line between support and control disappeared entirely, and people close to them noticed the shift. Audrey was one of the most recognized women in the world, and inside that marriage, she deferred to him almost completely. Running alongside all of it was the question of children, which carried its own accumulation of grief. More than almost anything else in her life, she wanted to be a mother, not casually, but with an urgency that people who knew her described as something she carried in her bones. In 1955, she became pregnant and miscarried, and the loss devastated her. Then in 1959, filming The Unforgiven, a horse threw her during a riding scene. The fall broke her back. Weeks in hospital followed, and then another miscarriage. In 1960, she finally gave birth to her son Sean, and for a full year, something almost unheard of for someone at her level of fame, She stepped back from acting entirely and devoted herself to motherhood. None of it repaired what had been breaking inside the marriage. The whispers that had circulated for years became impossible to ignore. Ferrer's temper, his jealousy, and eventually infidelity on both sides. After 14 years, it ended, and she walked away emotionally drained but free in a way she hadn't been in well over a decade. Before any of that, though, there was William Holden. The set of Sabrina in 1954 had been uncomfortable before filming even began, because Humphrey Bogart had wanted the role for his wife Lauren Bacall, and when the studio chose Audrey instead, he made his resentment known through silence and deliberate cold professionalism, treating her as an unwelcome presence on a set he believed she hadn't earned. Holden responded to her in the exact opposite way. The chemistry between them was real, visible to everyone, and what began as genuine closeness during production deepened fast into a romantic relationship behind the scenes. Holden proposed. Audrey said no. The reason was straightforward and final. She wanted children, and Holden had already had a vasectomy. No amount of feeling could change that arithmetic. He never entirely moved on, and the fact that she walked away from someone she clearly cared about said something she hadn't said in words, that wanting someone and trusting them with your future were two entirely separate calculations, and she had learned early and painfully to keep those calculations separate. By the late 1960s, she had become something beyond a film actress. Breakfast at Tiffany's, Charade, My Fair Lady. She had turned into a cultural institution, and then without warning, she walked away from all of it. Studios were offering her almost anything. Directors wanted her. Audiences adored her. She left anyway because fame had started costing her son Sean something she wasn't willing to keep paying. On a Mediterranean cruise, she met Andrea Dotti, an Italian psychiatrist, charming and warm and socially fluent in ways that felt like relief after the rigidity of her first marriage. Within 6 months they were married, and she moved to Rome, leaning deliberately into the idea of a quieter life. The version of Dottie she had met on that boat turned out to be carefully constructed for the occasion. The affairs started early and didn't stop, and they weren't discreet. Reports of his extramarital relationships became a regular feature of the Italian press. She had left Hollywood to escape the intrusion of public life and found herself living inside a very different kind of spectacle. She stayed longer than most expected, partly for their son Luca, born in 1970, and partly because she was not someone who abandoned commitments without a fight. When it finally ended, those close to her said the divorce left her more guarded than she had ever been before. In the 1960s, she had tracked down her father using the Red Cross. Joseph Rustin had been living quietly in Dublin since 1939, the same year he had sent her away. She approached the reunion carrying hope. Warmth, perhaps, or acknowledgement, some form of repair after decades of wondering. What she found was a man with almost nothing to offer, distant, indifferent. The reconciliation she had built in her imagination for 30 years simply didn't materialize. She forgave him anyway, and not only that, she supported him financially for the rest of his life. That single detail says more about who Audrey Hepburn was than almost any role she ever appeared in. After the divorce from Dottie, she moved to a farmhouse in Tolochenaz, Switzerland, a place she called La Paisible, the peaceful one, and the name was not accidental. Major roles got turned down. The social circuit got abandoned. Time went into the garden, into walking her dogs, into cooking meals, and living in a way that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who knew only the Audrey Hepburn of the screen. Robert Wolders came into her life at a charity auction in the late 1970s, a Dutch actor and businessman who had recently lost his wife, the actress Merle Oberon, after a long illness. Their first exchange was quiet and unremarkable. He invited her somewhere and she declined, said she had work. The following day she reached out and suggested a drink. That drink became a conversation lasting hours, and the daily phone calls that followed led somewhere neither of them had planned on. What they built together wasn't glamorous, and that was precisely the point. Both had lived through enough loss, enough public exposure, enough relationships that had asked them to become something other than themselves. What they gave each other was simpler than anything either had known before: steadiness, respect, and a shared preference for the unhurried and the real. They never married formally. She didn't feel the need. She introduced him as her husband not because the paperwork existed, but because in every way that actually mattered to her, the commitment was already complete. Then in 1988, at a UNICEF concert she attended simply as a guest, she found herself standing on a stage speaking without a script about hunger, about occupation, about what it meant to be a child in wartime. A senior UNICEF official in the audience offered her a full ambassadorship by the end of the evening. She accepted, and the years that followed took her to Ethiopia, Sudan, Bangladesh, and El Salvador, some of the most difficult environments on earth, in conditions that mirrored what she had survived in the Netherlands 50 years earlier. Those who accompanied her on those missions consistently noted that she didn't approach the work as an obligation. She approached it as something unfinished, a debt she felt she owed to the version of herself that a relief worker had once handed a chocolate bar to after liberation. Wolders traveled with her on many of those trips, present not as a companion managing a celebrity's schedule, but as someone who refused to let her face the hardest parts alone. In 1992, after returning from a humanitarian trip to Somalia, she began experiencing severe abdominal pain. Testing in Los Angeles confirmed pseudomyxoma peritonei, a rare and aggressive cancer originating in the appendix. Surgery was performed quickly, but the disease had already spread too far. Terminal. She absorbed that news without visible collapse. And those around her in those final months described a composure so complete it was almost unsettling. What she expressed most was not fear of dying, but regret about the work she would leave unfinished. Her one request was to go home. Hubert de Givenchy, her close friend of nearly 40 years, the fashion designer who had dressed her through the most iconic chapters of her public life, arranged a private jet and made the journey possible. She arrived back at La Paisible, spent a final Christmas surrounded by the people who mattered most, and gave gifts with specific intention. Winter coats for the three men she was closest to: Wolders, her son Sean, and Givenchy. On January 20th, 1993, she died peacefully at home. Her funeral was held at a small local church in Tolochenaz, intimate in exactly the way she would have wanted. Gregory Peck, her co-star from Roman Holiday 4 decades earlier, the man who had insisted she receive equal billing on a film where she was entirely unknown, read one of her favorite poems. Both former husbands attended. Her sons were there. Wolders stood among them. The man she had named in her final years as the one she never truly got over was not among those gathered. He had been dead for years. The answer was her father, not in any sentimental, simple way, but in the way an unhealed wound shapes everything that grows around it. Joseph Rustin left when she was 6. He didn't come when she sat waiting at school. He sent her into a war zone and wasn't there when the war arrived. He greeted her reunion decades later with indifference and died without giving her the answer she had spent a lifetime waiting for. And yet she forgave him, supported him financially, carried him in every interview and every quiet conversation in the years she had left. In the interviews from her final years, she returned to him with a consistency that struck everyone who knew her. Not with bitterness, because she wasn't built for sustained bitterness, but with a quiet, unresolved wondering. What had he been thinking? Whether he had ever felt the absence the way she had. Whether somewhere inside him there had been something that simply couldn't be expressed. Robert Wolders said afterward that what struck him most about Audrey was not her beauty or her talent. It was her capacity for forgiveness. Not the uncomplicated kind, but the kind that requires you to keep loving someone who gave you almost no reason to continue. Every man she stayed with past the point of reason, every child she sat beside in the dust of Ethiopia and Sudan, everything she poured into humanitarian work in the years she had left, all of it traces back to that first departure, the first man who was supposed to stay and didn't. She once said that the best thing you could leave your children was the feeling of being loved. Given everything she had spent her life searching for, and everything she had spent her life trying to give away, it was the simplest and most honest thing she ever said.